John Stapleton from the Metcalf Foundation and St. Christopher House.
What I'd like to do is have you think of yourself going in a time machine and going back 77 years to 1932. And if you could go in that time machine and put yourself in that and think of what Toronto looked like in 1932. About 5 blocks from here, right at this time of year, it was during the month of July of 1932, a Royal Commission on Direct Relief that was run by the Ontario's top businessman, who at that time was a fellow by the name of Wallace Campbell, who ran the Ford Motor Company of Canada. And in that review, he devised what in effect were what we might call the first social assistance rates. And it was the report went back to Premier Henry, and at the time, and he said, "Wow, this is way too radical to actually pay people actual cash money." And one of the things that Campbell had put in his report was the idea of that housing costs should be 40% of the social assistance rates, and he had different rates for singles and couples with children. When it was David Kroll, who was a 34-year-old minister under Mitch Hepburn in 1934, who dusted off this Campbell report and actually put in the first relief rates in Ontario and paid out cash money to people somewhere in 1935. But it was interesting that we conducted that review of social assistance and poverty reduction in 1932, and that report had a lot of traction through 1934 and 1935. In fact, what the forerunner of or the antecedent to the Social Planning Council was asked by the Ontario government whether we should have cash assistance rates, and they actually came back saying no, that it was too radical an idea. So very interesting. But right about the same time, a housing commission was also doing its work, and it was done by Lieutenant Governor Herbert Bruce, who in fact was the person who started the Wellesley, which is now the Wellesley Institute. And he was Lieutenant Governor at that time, and he came up with the idea of having what would look like to us now as urban renewal or a form of public housing. And it was done entirely separately from the poverty reduction and the social assistance review. And it seems that now we're somewhat doing the same thing, where we're going to have a review of public housing. And for those of you who are interested, it's all in this book. I always try to come with one book and say, here's something that everybody should read. But it's the Historical Atlas of Toronto, and it's got a picture of the Green Report, saying the report of the Lieutenant Governor's Committee on Housing Conditions in Toronto. And I'll just read that it says that in 1936, because of this report, a bylaw was passed regulating standards for housing, a Canadian first. And a new Federal Loans Guarantee Act was also passed in 1936, partly in response to Toronto's leadership. So we had a housing report and a housing commission by the Lieutenant Governor, and we had a report basically on relief at the same time. And we seem to be repeating that in the same way, with the reports being off on separate tracks. And I would try to make the case that since the government has announced a social assistance review, because it has announced a social policy institute and a citizen-centered approach to services, which is all in the report by Deb Matthews, the Breaking the Cycle report, that we could start looking at some of these things together. And the way I think it should come together, and I'm going to talk about one thing that came out of some of those early reports, and finally in the 1970s, some provinces started and some nations started to implement something that we call a housing benefit. And just a short format, the only housing benefit that we actually have in Ontario, or the only significant one, is within social assistance itself, and that's called the shelter component. And what happened in the mid-1990s, that when social assistance was being cut back by 21.6%, it actually cut back the shelter component by 21.6%. So we had a very large housing benefit at that time being cut by that amount. And also in 1997, that same shelter component was cut to homeless people and was disallowed to them. And in 1998, that same shelter component that could be paid to people in the working poor population was also cut when supplementary aid and special assistance programs in GWA, for some of those who remember that, were also cut. So here we have a social assistance shelter component that was cut down, and at the same time only goes to a very, it goes to a population that for the very poor don't get it in terms of the homeless, and those people who are working poor don't get it. So one of the things that a number of us have been looking at is the idea of a shelter, a renewed shelter benefit that would again go to all elements of people who are low income and living in poverty. It would go to people who are homeless. It would go to people who are in the working poor population. And the way we would do that is simply take the social assistance benefit that we have right now that is divided into basic needs and shelter, which it has been divided by basic needs and shelter going back to the 1930s, and which was enforced by a federal program called the Canada Assistance Plan. Now that Canada, if that's for me, I'm out. The Canada Assistance Plan was actually ended by the federal government in 1996, but we kept this structure of having basic needs and shelter. And we really don't need that anymore. We could declare the amount that's paid now as basic needs and shelter, we could simply declare that to be basic, because the amount is very low, and just say that's one indivisible rate, and then on top of that, pay a shelter benefit, or a housing benefit as we have called it, to all people, those on social assistance, those who are financially eligible for social assistance but cannot collect it, for homeless people, and say, here is a shelter benefit that we will pay starting at the base rent that is already in social assistance, and then pay that on top of the amounts that are now paid for shelter benefits. So in other words, it would be a model that wouldn't have in it the idea of a clawback. And that's when the National Child Benefit was implemented, you all know that it had this clawback component to it. So we're suggesting a benefit that would go on top of social assistance and would pay from the shelter benefit component amounts right now, which are very, very low, and which you've heard people already stated very low, and then pay an amount up to the median rent in a particular community, so that it would be able to actually, it would recognize that shelter costs in some remote communities that may be very low and yet may be very high in like a community like Toronto or Ottawa, and so that you would actually pay more in shelter benefits in those places. And we would do it not at 100%, but at a very high percent, such as 75%, so that it wouldn't have the effect that people often say that it would inflate the cost of housing, because the rental market would take that into account and therefore start charging higher rents. So that we view as one arrow in the quiver. It's just one idea that could be used that would help pay benefits outside of social assistance, and yet at the same time would pay benefits to those people who were originally cut out of those benefits back in 1995, 1997, and 1998. So it's a way of taking the shelter benefit that was paid and bringing it back, redesigning it, taking it outside of social assistance like the OCB, the Ontario Child Benefit, and then add that as a significant component to that. I have a number of things that I could say in support of that, but I'll wait for the question. Thank you.